Okay, today is Monday, 14th October, and we still await news of any Iranian retaliatory strike against Iran in response to the Iranian attack on Israel, the missile attack on Israel, which took place, by my recollection, 2 weeks ago on 1st October. So far, there's little indication of when or if or in what form that attack will be. But Israeli television is apparently saying that discussions via Qatar are underway between Iran and the United States, and supposedly the Iranians have told the Americans that if the Israeli attack is limited, then Iran might choose to make no further attacks on Israel in order to de-escalate the situation. I have to say that other reports that I've heard tell a completely different story. They speak of continuing statements from Iran to the United States via Qatar, that if there is an Israeli strike on Iran, then Iran will respond strongly. But, well, we'll just have to wait and see. There might be logic in Iran again pulling its punches. It made a strong demonstration of its capability in the strike it launched on 1st October. Iran, as I've discussed in many programs going all the way back to the events of 7th October last year, when Hamas attacked Israel, Iran is not seeking and has not been seeking a general war in the Middle East at this time, nor, for the record, so far as I can see, at any time since the war that Saddam Hussein of Iraq, the leader of Iraq, imposed upon it in the 1980s, had ended. So I don't get the sense that the Iranians have at any point been looking for a war. They have been responding to what they see as provocations directed against them. Anyway, we will see what happens. We will see what steps are made. But there are a few things which I do want to discuss briefly, touching on matters which I have discussed in previous programs. My first comment is about the THAAD anti-ballistic missile system that the United States is now deploying to Israel. Now, the first thing to say is that apparently a radar system from the THAAD system has been deployed in Israel for some time, but no THAAD missile launchers have been based in Israel. The Iranians apparently believe that this radar system was the most effective in tracking their missiles. At least that's what I've heard. I'm not able to confirm it, but that's what I've heard. But anyway, the radar system of the THAAD missiles, of the THAAD system, has been in Israel, but not so far any launchers. And apparently a launcher with 48 of these THAAD missiles will now be deployed to Israel with around 100 US operators. Now, since I made my program yesterday, in which I discussed the THAAD missile system, I've had a number of emails and explanations about the system, which I want to share and which I want to discuss. First point to say is that when I spoke yesterday of the system being much more advanced than the Patriot, well, a number of people have taken strong exception to that. They've disagreed with it. And they've said that in some respects, the technologies of the THAAD system and those of the Patriot system are not particularly different, that there are significant overlaps in the technologies and in the respective design philosophies. The THAAD system is, however, different, significantly different from the Patriot, in that THAAD missiles are interceptors intended to bring down ballistic missiles, specifically very long-range ballistic missiles, the kind that North Korea uses, and that the intention is to intercept and destroy these missiles, or at least to hit these missiles at very, very high altitudes. One commentator said in the email he sent to me an altitude of around 150 kilometers. That's, well, to me that sounds like very, very high in the upper atmosphere. And the missiles, the THAAD missiles, work by striking the incoming missile. They don't apparently carry a warhead, so it's purely a kinetic contact that enables the THAAD missile, if it hits the target, to destroy the target. So anyway, that's the nature of the missile. Obviously, a missile of this kind is technologically going to be very different from a Patriot missile interceptor. And it will require entirely different type of rocket engine and rocket fuels. And no doubt there are different guidance systems, which I'm not going to discuss because, frankly, I don't have the expertise to discuss them. THAAD missiles are very expensive, and they are in short supply and in very limited production. Now, I've checked the open sources, and they speak of around 1,000 THAAD missiles having been produced over the lifetime of this system, which is roughly a decade, just over a decade. So we're talking about around 1,000 missiles in existence in all corners of the world. And it's a reasonable guess that not all of these missiles are fully operational. Now, I have seen it reported by various third parties, they've mentioned it to me, that Brian Beletic, presumably in one of his programs, though if so I've missed it, has apparently discussed the THAAD missile system. He says that he, according to his estimates, apparently, I mean, I want to stress, I haven't actually heard Brian himself say this or seen anything that he's written on this. So if I'm getting this wrong, I apologize first and foremost to him and to other people who are reporting, informing me of what he said and whom I have probably misunderstood. But anyway, he estimates that perhaps there's 800 actual operational missiles available around the world, which on the basis of a total production of around 1,000 missiles seems to me about right. And again, according to these third parties who've contacted me to tell me what Brian Beletic has been saying or writing, he estimates that annual production of these missiles is around 50. Now, putting aside what Brian Beletic may or may not have said or written, a total pool of around 1,000 missiles, assuming that all of them are operational, which I have to say I think is extremely unlikely, doesn't seem to be anywhere near enough to parry the kind of heavy missile barrages we would likely to see being launched against Israel by Iran. Now, with most air defense missiles, the expectation would be that the defending force would launch 2 air defense missiles to shoot down 1 incoming missile. Perhaps the THAAD works in a different way, though I wonder. But assuming that it does, well, Iran launched 180 ballistic missiles at Israel 2 weeks ago. If the only system had been the THAAD tasked with repelling it, that would have needed around 360 missiles, which, as we can see, is more than a third of the total number of THAAD missiles in existence. Of course, Israel has its own air defense systems, its Iron Domes, its Arrows, its David Slings. There's also Patriot missile systems located in Israel as well, or at least there were. So, I mean, obviously, this is not really in any way the situation. But the point is that there's finite numbers of these Israeli missiles as well. And as we see, the numbers of THAAD missiles are also very finite. And if we're talking about 48 missiles deployed to Israel, that sounds to me very close to the 50 missiles which I've heard Brian Beletic supposedly said would be as many missiles as are produced, THAAD missiles, as are produced in any 1 year. In other words, the launcher with the missiles deployed in Israel would account for a full 1 year production of these missiles. Now, as I said, one can start to see the problem. Even if these missiles are absolutely effective in shooting down ballistic missiles, and I suspect they are effective in shooting down some ballistic missiles, they're probably not capable of shooting down every ballistic missile in a swarm that is launched or a barrage that is launched against Israel. But let's assume that they are successful in shooting down 90% of the missiles that they're targeted at. Well, over time, a fairly brief time, Israel and the United States would run out of missiles if the Iranians really do have 3,000 ballistic missiles they can launch at Israel. And there are some claims, of course, that they have many more. And that isn't even taking into account the 100,000 missiles and rockets that Hezbollah has, and the missiles that the Houthis have, and all of those factors as well. So the THAAD is not going to change the fundamental balance. It's not going to alter the overall military position in any significant way, which then begs the question of why it's being deployed at all. Why is the United States deploying a very expensive system equipped by American troops who will now be in the line of fire to Israel when the US must know, and the US must also know that the Israelis, the Iranians, and by the way, the Russians also know that this system really isn't going to be enough. The numbers of this system are not going to be enough to make a significant difference. Well, the answer is that it's a show of support. It's a show of support by the United States to Israel, and it is also, no doubt, intended as messaging to the American public in advance of the election in November. But it is dangerous messaging. Dangerous messaging because, of course, the very fact of the deployment of this system is likely to be seen by the Iranians as further proof that the Israeli systems are not proving as effective as we had been led to suppose. And it's also dangerous because by bringing American troops into the line of fire, it is potentially risking a situation in which some of those troops could be killed, drawing the United States further towards an all-out confrontation with Iran. Anyway, there it is. That's all I'm going to say about the THAAD system. I'll just make one brief general point about air defense systems. I think my own sense over the course of this conflict, over the Ukraine conflict and the Middle East conflict, the current conflict in the Middle East, is that American air defense systems are not as effective and is not as effectively operated as Russian systems are. And this is completely unsurprising to me. It is not because the Russians have an enormous lead technologically right across the board over the Americans. It is simply a product of underlying military doctrines and philosophies. The United States has not fought a war since 1943 in which it did not have air superiority. And I think that the United States cannot truly conceive of a war in which it does not have air superiority. The result is that air defense missiles have never been given a particular priority within the US procurement process. To the extent that Americans think about air defense systems, it is much more about how to overcome them rather than on how to create and deploy them in large numbers. With the Russians, of course, it is completely different. Going back to the Cold War, they were faced with a situation where the United States appeared to have a decisive superiority in air power. That meant that from the early 1950s, the Soviets began developing the very sophisticated and advanced air defense system that we have now. And that's why the Russians are able to produce air defense missiles and their associated radars and control systems in quantities that the United States is not able to match. Now, as for the Israeli system, clearly Israel, by contrast, has invested a great deal in its system. But again, speaking as someone with some experience of industrial matters, I would say that this is a relatively recent system, and compared to the Russian system, it is likely, therefore, to be rather raw and untested. The Russians have been operating air defense missiles or supplying air defense missiles to their allies, the North Vietnamese and others, ever since the 1960s. They've been able, therefore, to track and watch and examine and research how air defense systems work in actual combat conditions, and they've been able to do that for decades. And they will have been able to learn the lessons from that in developing their new systems, in developing how to operate their existing systems, and how to update the operations of their systems, taking into account the lessons that they have learned. They will have available data and information about all of this with training systems and operating systems to match on a scale which Israel, which has operated a system, an air defense system of its own, for a relatively short time, cannot possibly hope to match. Now, again, this is not a question here of intellect. It's simply a question of knowledge developed out of experience. Now, of course, if you have a system built on completely new principles, entirely different from systems that have existed before, well, it may be that the experience of the past is no longer relevant anymore. But I don't get the impression that that is true of the air defense system of Israel any more than it is of any other air defense system in existence at this time. So anyway, that is a somewhat long tangent of discussion on this subject. It looks as if the THAAD, as I said, is not going to change anything very much. And as for the Israeli system, Obviously, it has its strong points and it has its weak points, but we have seen that the Iranians can bypass it. Now, the second point I wanted to make is about the fighting in southern Lebanon, and unsurprisingly, I've had intense comments from various people about the fighting in southern Lebanon. In some comments, according to some people, the Israelis are walking it. The Hezbollah is putting up barely any resistance. The Israelis are inflicting disproportionately heavy losses on Hezbollah. I mean, about 10, 20, 30 to 1. Whereas Hezbollah is incapable of holding the Israelis back and is in effect being routed. That's one view I've seen. One person in particular has written to me a number of emails stating it very forcefully. And by the way, I should say this is someone whose comments are taken very seriously. He's been in the militaries. He's been in the military. He has knowledge of war, which frankly I don't. And anyway, that is his perspective. There have been other people with similar levels of knowledge who take the diametrically opposite view. They're saying that Israel is at a standstill, that it's been able to advance perhaps 2.5 kilometers into Lebanese territory, that it has not managed to dent or break Hezbollah's military defense system. The fact that the Israelis are having to deploy more and more troops to southern Lebanon is itself confirmation that things are not going according to whatever plan the Israelis originally had, and that the advantage in this intense fighting currently lies with Hezbollah. So who's telling the truth? Well, the short answer is I don't know. I am not there. I can only read what both sides say. Each side, no doubt, is spinning the events in southern Lebanon in their own interests, as one would expect. I am not sure. I cannot be sure what exactly is taking place in southern Lebanon. What I am going to say is this, and these are general points. The first, I return to the point I made previously, which is that in operations of this kind, what Hezbollah has to do is to avoid losing, in which case it wins. I say this because a militia like Hezbollah, now that it has come through the initial shock of the Israeli strikes and assassinations of its leaders, so long as it is able to keep fighting, so long as it is able to remain in contention, so long as it continues to have the support of its base, and Hezbollah does have a large base and ultimately the backing of Iran, well, it can afford prolonged attrition, even if that means taking more losses than the other side. Whereas in the case of Israel, prolonged attrition over time works against it, just as it has done over the last year in Gaza. So Israel should not want to get drawn into a war of attrition in southern Lebanon. And my sense is that that is exactly what is starting to shape out there. I may be wrong, but that's my impression. Now, that actually does bring me to a further point, one that I discussed with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis on Daniel Davis Deep Dive a short time ago, last week, and that is, what exactly is the Israeli objective through launching this attack in southern Lebanon? Is it to destroy Hezbollah? Well, if so, I think with every day that passes, that objective is less likely to be achieved? Is it to push Hezbollah back so far that Hezbollah stops launching rockets into northern Israel? Well, I'm not sure how achievable that is, because many of Hezbollah's rockets would have sufficient range to be able to strike Israel from distances far beyond the Litani River, which is said to be Israel's objective. Now, the other thing I've heard is that Israel is seeking to carve out a buffer zone in southern Lebanon, south of the Litani River. All I would say about that plan is that, of course, Israel has tried it before. It's exactly what Israel sought to do in the 1980s, as I very well remember. It didn't turn out at all well. The Israelis found that they couldn't control the territory in southern Lebanon, that trying to remain there simply exposed them to what was in effect an insurgency, the very insurgency which ultimately spawned Hezbollah. And ultimately, the cost of trying to defeat this insurgency, which Israel was unable to do, was simply too high, compelling Israel to pull back beyond its own border. So, what is the plan? I'm not able to see the plan. I cannot understand what the plan is. We discussed this, Daniel Davis and myself, on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You can see the discussion we had there. As a military person, he wasn't able to gauge the plan either, and I certainly cannot see, I myself cannot see what the plan is. Maybe there is a plan and I haven't figured it out. That's quite possible. But if anybody can explain to me what the plan is, then I would be grateful. I fear that the real plan is not to wage a war aiming to destroy Hezbollah, or to establish a buffer zone in South Lebanon, or to do any of the other things that people are saying, to push Hezbollah beyond range so that it can't launch missile strikes against northern Israel anymore. I feel rather that the purpose of the operation in South Lebanon is precisely to act as a stepping stone towards that conflict with Iran, the one that I've talked about many times, and which it is absolutely clear to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu and senior officials of his government are aiming towards. In other words, the war against Hezbollah is a means to an end. It is not the end itself. It's not the objective, if you like, is not really there. Well, if so, then that is a very dangerous game. If the Israelis find themselves in a war with Iran, then my own view is that they will multiply their problems rather than reduce them, multiply their problems by an exponential degree, just saying. And of course, if the war with Iran doesn't come, then they risk repeating all over again what happened in southern Lebanon in 1982, when, as I said, it didn't end well. So there it is. Those are the general things I wanted to say. Those are the two topics that I wanted to discuss. On both issues, of course, I welcome further comments. I'll be very interested to see what people have to say. But as I said, those are my views on these topics for the present time. Now, what else is taking place? Well, diplomatic activity remains intense. It seems that the Americans and the Iranians are in contact with each other. The back channel is provided by Qatar. It seems that the Qatar authorities now regularly convey messages from the Iranians to the Americans and the Americans to the Iranians, and some kind of a dialogue, at least at some level, between these two countries is underway, though I'm not far from convinced that this is a dialogue that is working out very well. Anyway, we have had some very interesting comments from the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, arising from stories which have specifically circulated in Reuters, the British news agency Reuters, about Iranian missile deliveries to Russia. And this is a report that I'm getting now from an Iranian news agency, the Tasnim news agency, which I believe has some kind of semi-official status in Iran. Anyway, this is what this report from the Tasnim news agency says. On Saturday, Reuters quoted a high-ranking EU official as saying that Foreign Minister Araghchi had told EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York that Iran had supplied short-range rockets to Russia that could fly up to 250 kilometers. The EU official, speaking on condition of anonymity, also claimed to Reuters that Araghchi insisted the rockets were not ballistic and did not specify when they had been transferred. And then Tasnim reports this. Foreign Minister Araghchi gave an account of what he actually told Borrell and Deputy Secretary General of the European External Action Service, Enrique Mora, in meetings in New York. And this is now what I'm now going to read is an direct quote from Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, made, I presume, to the Tasnim news agency. 1. Iran-Russia military cooperation is not new. It has a history going back long before the Ukraine crisis began. 2. Some Europeans have provided the Israeli government with all kinds of sophisticated weapons and have anxiously engaged in military operations against Iran. I don't know what Araghchi is referring to. I'm not sure of any European state that has been involved in military operations against Iran, unless, of course, what he means, and this might be a problem of translation, that Israel has engaged in military operations against Iran and has done so using European technology. Anyway, the quote from Araghchi continues. 3. US maximum pressure policy is still in place, and the business community in Europe follows US instructions in full. And those were the three main things that Araghchi says he told the EU officials. But then the Tasnim news agency goes on to quote him saying, I clearly said, this is again to the same EU officials, to Borrell and Mora, I clearly said and reiterate once again, we have not provided ballistic missiles to Russia. If Europe needs a case to appease Israel's blackmail, better find another story. So that's what Araghchi is saying. He's saying that all of the reports that you have heard and seen about us, the Iranians, supplying ballistic missiles to Russia to help the Russians conduct operations in Ukraine are untrue. They are false. Now, the Iranians and the Russians have in the past claimed that Iran did not provide any uranium any drone technology to Russia. But I think, like most people, the Uranium-2 drones, the original ones, they've now been significantly updated by the Russians. But the original Uranium-2 drones seem to me to have been identical with Iranian Shahid drones. And I think that the Iranians and the Russians were either straightforwardly lying or were being economical with the truth. It may be that the Iranians provided plans to the Russians and the Russians worked on those plans. But anyway, they weren't being honest and straightforward. But this is a straightforward denial from Arakchi that Iran has supplied ballistic missiles to Russia. And one does wonder whether Arakchi would lie so straightforwardly about something like this, given that when those missiles are used, if they are ever used, and if they do in fact exist, well, he will, as he must know, be caught out in a lie. Perhaps nonetheless he is lying, but what if he is telling the truth? What if this is a story which, as his last comment hints, has been circulated in order to put Iran in a bad light, at least in the eyes of Western opinion, so as to justify the current preparations for a war against Iran? I'm going to suggest that if that is true, then it calls into question a lot of the other stories that we have been hearing recently. So if Arakchi's denial is true, and there have been no Iranian missile deliveries to Russia, then I'm going to suggest that it's likely also true that the similar reports we have been receiving about Russian air defense missile deliveries to Iran, the ones that were current in the summer and which have continued since, that those reports are also untrue and that the Russians have not supplied S-400 and S-300 anti-air defense missiles, as for a time I myself had thought that they might have done. Just saying. And again, it could all be part of a narrative that has been spun, and intentionally spun, to give the impression that Russia and Iran are working much more closely together than they really are, and perhaps to heighten the sense of threat from Iran, that Iran is an ally of Russia in Ukraine, and we are defending Ukraine, and that Iran is a threat to Israel, and we are defending Israel. I don't think this is a possibility that can be discounted at all. In fact, I'm going to go further. I'm going to say that I am strongly tempted to go along with this view, in which case my earlier guess is that the Iranians had held back from missile strikes against Israel because they were waiting to absorb Russian air defense technology were probably wrong. Just saying. Now, it is nonetheless probably true that the Russians and the Iranians are cooperating with each other on military matters. After all, Arakchi has confirmed this. Iran-Russia military cooperation is not new. It has a long history going back long before the Ukrainian crisis began. That is a quote from him provided by the Tasnim news agency. And I've speculated that if the Iranians have indeed developed hypersonic missile technology, more likely than not, and this is my own speculation, they've had help from the Russians to do it. And I've now had a whole number of confirmations from all kinds of people that they at least believe that the Russians have been providing the Iranians with guidance and data information, and that this was this partly explains the effectiveness of the strike that Iran conducted against Israel on 1st October. And if that is true, it's likely, we know that there is a major arms deal between Russia and Iran pending, then it is likely that the topic of S-400 missile deliveries from Russia to Iran has been discussed, and perhaps of deliveries of other less sophisticated missiles like the S-300, that's been discussed also. It'd be very, very typical of the Russians to discuss ideas like that with the Iranians, but then to float this idea with their other partners in the Middle East, the Saudis, the other Gulf states, perhaps even the Israelis, to gauge what their reaction might be before they took a decision to actually supply a system as powerful as the S-400. It's very typical of what the Russians do. They usually tiptoe very carefully to these decisions, and it would be entirely consistent, and it may be that that's how the idea that the Russians might be providing Iran with S-400 systems got about, and that this provided the seed for this story that we're hearing now. Now, if this is correct, then it's plausible that in time, S-400 systems might indeed be provided to Iran. The Russians are already committed to providing Iran with sophisticated Sukhoi 35 fighter jets. It's quite plausible that S-400s will eventually follow once the Russians have squared all of this with the other important regional powers. And I think for them at this time, the most important of those is, of course, the Saudis. So that could be what is going on. But suffice to say, I think that probably, more likely than not, there are currently no S-400s in Iran. There are probably Russian radar systems. There's probably Russian electronic warfare systems. We know that there are some trainer aircraft, Yak-130 trainers in Iran, but so far, most probably, no S-400s. Anyway, let's wait and see how these developments play out. If there is a long drawn-out conflict between between Israel and Iran, it is likely that, as happened during the Vietnam War of the 1960s, we will gradually see Russian air defense systems being introduced into Iran in order to counter Israeli strikes, though this will probably be a very carefully controlled process. Anyway, one further thing to say is that the Iranians have also now provided their own very detailed accounts of what passed between Pezeshkian and Putin, and the overall impression that the Iranians are giving is that most of the discussions centered on the strategic partnership agreement that the Russians and the Iranians are negotiating with each other. Pezeshkian came principally to meet Putin in Ashgabat to give that whole process a push, and the Iranians are hoping to sign, that there will be a formal signing ceremony at the BRICS summit in Kazan, at which this agreement will finally be agreed, this strategic partnership agreement will finally be agreed. In the meantime, the Iranians continue to be very, very busy. Pezeshkian himself spoke on Sunday to French President Emmanuel Macron. He told Macron that Iran had exercised extreme restraint after the Haniyeh assassination, following urgent requests from the Western powers to exercise that sort of restraint, with Iran being promised that the situation would de-escalate with ceasefires in Gaza and South Lebanon. Instead, there has been no de-escalation. On the contrary, escalation. It is escalation which has happened, and that this is unacceptable, and that Iran, for its part, cannot continue to exercise restraint in the same way. I'll just read again. This is the report from the Tasnim agency. Pezeshkian noted that Iran exercised self-restraint after the Israeli assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran, as Western governments had promised an impending ceasefire in Gaza, but Israel instead intensified its campaign of bombardment in Gaza and even spread it to Lebanon without commitment to any moral or international principles. Iran would welcome any support any initiative for peace, calm and stability in the region, Pezeshkian told Macron. And Pezeshkian further asked the French president to join hands with other European leaders to force the Israelis to stop their campaigns in Gaza and Lebanon. And the Iranian foreign minister has now moved on to Oman, where he's conferring with the government there. And he's also reported to have had a telephone call today with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, in which supposedly the Chinese and the Iranians again discussed in detail the general situation and the way forward. Now, all of this, even as the war continues, we've had reports, there were many reports yesterday, about a major Hezbollah drone attack on a facility, a military facility inside Israel. It's clear that the drone attack, using a drone storm, took the Israelis by surprise, and their air defense system wasn't functioning. And it's also clear that several Israelis were caught in the attack and that several of them were killed. And there's even reports of very senior Israeli officers being killed, though one shouldn't leap to those assumptions until we know an awful lot more than at the moment we actually do. But anyway, those are the reports that are circulating at the moment, and the fighting, as I said, continues. And, well, we will see whether the negotiations, the discussions between the Iranians and the Americans, where they will lead, whether the missile strike by Iran on Israel this time will be sufficient to re-establish deterrence and to persuade both the Americans and the Israelis that a further missile strike on Iran might not be a wise thing. But I have to say that, to me, all of this diplomatic activity by Iran, the contacts with the Iraqis, the Gulf states, the meeting with MBS, the meetings with Putin, the call to Macron, all of this has, to me, the look about it of actions taken by Iran by the Iranian political leadership, not so much to avert a war, which I sense they believe is coming, but rather to prepare their own political position once the war begins, so that they can turn round to the world community and say, with a great measure of truth in my opinion, that Iran was not seeking war, that the war was imposed upon it, that it has acted at all times as a force for calm and restraint, and that if war comes, the responsibility will lie not with Iran, but with the other side, with Israel and with the United States. Whether in the United States this is understood, whether it is understood in Israel itself, I'm not sure. Anyway, that is where we are. Very complex diplomatic maneuvers by Iran, very different from what Israel appears to be trying to do at the moment. The Israelis focused, I get the sense, overwhelmingly on military, on the military aspects of the current conflict. Though, as I said already, I'm not at all clear what their plan or ultimate objective is, whilst the Iranians are busy tying up their alliances, strengthening their alliances with their friends, talking to friendly neutrals like China and Russia, working to win over countries like the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Oman, by the way, Azerbaijan as well. The Iranians have been in touch with the Aliyev government in Azerbaijan, asking the Azerbaijanians to remain out of this conflict as well. Anyway, the Iranians working very hard to prepare their diplomatic position in advance of the conflict, which I sense they are sure will come. So anyway, we will see. We will see what Israel does over the next couple of days. We will see what the United States does. My own view is that the deployment of the THAAD missile system to Israel is a further sign that an attack on Iran is coming, and that the Americans, or at least the administration, what it is seeking to do at the present time is to signal to the Iranians, by this move, the strength of America's commitment to Israel. Where that commitment might eventually lead, I don't think that debate in the United States is properly or thoroughly taking place. Anyway, that's my review as of this morning of the general very fraught situation in the Middle East. Even as the war in the Middle East starts to develop and come closer into view, we have further signs, in my opinion, that the war in Ukraine is, well, not quite coming to an end, that we are definitely now in the process of the end game. And, well, this follows on reports that started to circulate late yesterday that US President Biden, having called off the Ramstein meeting on the 12th of October, the meeting which was intended to discuss President Zelensky's so-called victory plan, that President Biden does now intend to travel to Europe this week, to Germany to be precise, on the 18th of October, where he will receive some kind of award, meet and have discussions with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but that the meeting, the visit, will take place to a brief and very tight schedule. There is no suggestion that another Ramstein meeting will be rescheduled, that the Ramstein meeting can be rescheduled during the period of this visit, or that President Biden even has plans to meet President Zelensky, even though it's always possible that Zelensky, as he has sometimes had the habit of doing, will simply gate crash this meeting and turn up in Berlin and demand to be seen. Now, I can't help but think that this latest American move is not just a further sign that the United States is washing its hands of the Ukraine project, but that it is now going out of its way to signal this fact to the Ukrainians themselves and to America's European allies. I say this because it would surely have been much more tactful and considerate to the Ukrainians not to have gone ahead with this visit to Germany at all, to postpone it until after the president has left the White House, or until the president does have enough time to meet with Zelensky and with the other European leaders. The fact that the Americans have gone ahead with this meeting in Germany without convening a Ramstein meeting strongly suggests to me that they're telling everybody, they're telling the Europeans, they're telling the Ukrainians that they do not want a Ramstein meeting, they do not want to discuss Zelensky's victory plan, they do not want to meet with him, they do not want to hear the same things from him all over again, they do not want to discuss his plans for deep missile strikes into Russia. They don't want any of those things. That, at least, I have to say this, is my own impression. And the Ukrainians will undoubtedly have noticed this. And Zelensky's officials, and I'm guessing Zelensky himself, must be, frankly, concerned, unhappy about this. Anyway, there's been two very interesting comments about this whole situation in the media in Russia. The first is an article which has appeared in Izvestia, which strongly suggests to me that the Russian newspaper Izvestia, which strongly suggests to me that the Russians, seeing all of this diplomatic activity, but not diplomatic activity, seeing all of these signals coming out of the West, that the Russians made a soft reach out to the US through the US embassy in Moscow to find out whether the Americans might now be interested in talking perhaps about Ukraine, possibly about wider issues such as the security situation in Europe. And this is what Izvestia has written. US rules out talks with Russia on Ukraine. The US does not intend to negotiate with Russia on Ukraine on a bilateral basis, the US embassy in Moscow told Izvestia. Now, this might have been, of course, Izvestia's own initiative to contact the US embassy. But I wonder, Izvestia is not a government-controlled newspaper in the way that it was during the time of the Soviet Union, but I wonder whether it really would have reached out to the US embassy at this time without some prompting from someone in authority in the Kremlin or the foreign ministry or somewhere else. Anyway, just saying. Anyway, we are then told what the embassy told Izvestia, we made it clear that there will be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine's involvement. And in other words, that is a straightforward no. The Americans are not for the moment prepared to talk to the Russians about Ukraine. Ukraine, for its part, as we know, refuses to negotiate with the Russians. Zelensky has just said as much. He said he wants a diplomatic solution, but he doesn't want to negotiate with the Russians. And the Americans are hiding behind that and saying that they don't want to negotiate with the Russians either. So I see this, the way I see this is as the Russians flying a kite, contacting the embassy, getting Izvestia to do it for them, contacting the embassy, asking the embassy, well, you seem to be walking away from the crisis in Ukraine. Does that mean that you might be interested in some kind of talks or discussions? And the Americans coming back with a flat no. And the second article is about the wider situation in the Middle East. Over the conflict in Ukraine, and again we have it from Izvestia, which is that the Russians are basically saying that the Americans are dumping the entire problem on their allies in Europe. And this is what Izvestia reports. As Zelensky wraps up a series of visits to Europe, the Western media seems to be talking more and more about a diplomatic solution to the Ukraine conflict. Meanwhile, Kiev's allies are tightening their belts at home, and experts predict a significant reduction in the volume of financial assistance to Ukraine in 2025. Leading Western media outlets are already writing about the waning desire to help Kiev on both sides of the Atlantic. And Izvestia refers to Politico, The Guardian, The Economist, Fox News, The Washington Post, Le Figaro, Stern, Der Spiegel, and others. And we're told that this change in the narrative first started gaining traction in March 2023, although it seemed to subside from March to July 2024, when the hype around Ukraine's summer 2023 counteroffensive was at its peak. But after Kiev's widely publicized offensive failed, fatigue set in again. At the same time, rhetoric inside European countries is changing as well, where politicians demanding an end to hostilities are starting to be heard. But then we are told, and the quote is from Dmitry Suslov, who is Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive Economic Studies at the Higher School of Economics, and that he's actually a very well-known expert in Russia, foreign affairs, international affairs expert. Anyway, he then comes back. He then says that nothing, however, points to any sort of diplomatic breakthrough, at least for the time. Moscow and Washington remain very far apart. And this is a quote from Suslov. Russia keeps saying that the cause of the crisis lies not in the territories, as the United States insists. In other words, it's not, the Russians are not just going to simply sit back and accept that Ukraine allow them to occupy some territories. This is not enough for the Russians. But in NATO's policy in Ukraine. Moreover, the Istanbul agreements signed by Moscow were much better for Ukraine compared to conditions in any future negotiations. There are three options for the West: escalate, freeze, or accept Russia's conditions. The first is too dangerous. The second means capitulation. Therefore, the West is trying simultaneously to pressure both Kiev and Moscow to freeze, but at the same time leave Ukraine in its orbit of influence as a proxy tool against Russia. This is a fundamental mistake, and Moscow will not be satisfied with this option. So that is what Suslov says. So the Americans walking away, dumping it all on the Europeans, telling the Ukrainians and the Russians, you've got to negotiate, but go for a freeze. And the Russians trying to explain to the Americans that isn't going to work. This is a fundamental mistake. If it is too dangerous for you to escalate, as it is, and if a freeze is unacceptable to us, then your only realistic option is to accept our conditions, and that means talking to us, even if the Ukrainians don't want you to, and that also means that you've got to take the initiative and not try and dump it all on the Europeans and on your Ukrainian friends. And that explains, to my way of thinking, the previous outreach to the embassy, the US embassy in Moscow, the Russians trying to explain all of this to the Americans, but the Americans closing their ears, refusing to listen, preparing to walk away and to leave everything for the Europeans by themselves to sort out. The Europeans, incidentally, show no ability to take this matter forward by themselves without the Americans. Perhaps one of the purposes of Biden's trip to Berlin is to try to get the Germans to push forward in some way with the Russians in the US's place. I doubt the Russians will agree, and I suspect that if they're presented with that, the Germans won't be happy. But anyway, two interesting articles, both in Izvestia, one after the other, all of which suggest to me that actual diplomacy is at a standstill. The Western powers understand that the war is lost. The Ukrainians understand that the war is lost, but neither the Western powers, certainly not the United States, and not the Ukrainians, are prepared to do the only thing which makes any realistic sense, which is to negotiate with the Russians on the basis of the terms that the Russians have set out. So anyway, there we are. That's where we stand in the situation diplomatically in Ukraine. I don't think there will be any change before the new president takes office in January, whoever that president is. That's my own view. And of course, it may be that by then it will be too late. By then, the situation on the front lines will be even more catastrophic than it is now. And it could be that even the new president is not going to feel able or willing to move beyond this position that the Americans have staked out for themselves, which is walking away but refusing to talk. Now, I'm going to finish on this point simply again by referencing those very prescient articles in Naked Capitalism, which Eve Smith has written. She's made the point several times that the Russians could win the war, but in the absence of negotiations with the Western powers, they will have to make some very, very difficult decisions and think very hard about future plans and that, in a sense, it might be even in their interests to get a negotiation with the Europeans, with the Western powers, started as a way of drawing a line under the entire Ukrainian affair. It could be very dangerous for the Russians, or very difficult for them in the long term, if they win the war, but without a negotiation, a negotiated outcome that brings the conflict to a legal end. But all the indications are that that is exactly what we are going to end up with. The Russians will battle through, maybe to Kiev, maybe beyond that to Lvov itself, all the way to the Polish border, but the situation will remain unresolved. The West will refuse to negotiate. It will refuse to recognize what it considers to be Russian occupation of Ukraine. It will refuse to recognize any government that is set up in Kiev under Russian auspices. It will refuse to recognize any agreement reached by that government with the government in Moscow. And of course, if the Russians go further still, and through a process of referendums, maybe engage in further annexations, the Western powers will refuse to recognize that also. And in the meantime, tensions in Europe will continue and be continued indefinitely, and the Russians will be left having to sort out by themselves what to do with Ukraine, which might be a challenging and problematic thing to do. To my way of thinking, this is complete nihilism in terms of foreign policy. It is genuine scorched earth approach to diplomacy, but it is what I get the sense the Americans have decided on, and the Europeans appear to be going along with it. Anyway, there we are. That's two interesting articles in Izvestia. Let's turn to what is going on the battlefronts. And there's been quite a lot of news over the last 24 hours. I'm going to make a suggestion that the big news, actually the most important news at the moment, are the reports that the Ukrainian army is now starting to pull out of Toretsk. It could be that the battle for Toretsk is about to end. There's apparently fighting going on the coal mine and slag heap at the western end of Toretsk. The Russians are storming this coal mine and slag heap. The Ukrainians are still resisting there, but everybody agrees that this is not going to continue for very much longer. It looks as if Toretsk, therefore, the coal mine rather, is going to be captured by the Russians. There is general agreement that if that happens, Ukrainian control of what is left of Toretsk will become impossible. The Ukrainians perhaps controlling around a third of the town now. So it could be that as early as next week, we will see the whole of Toretsk finally and conclusively fall under Russian control. So there we are. That's, I suspect, the big news. And I've discussed in previous programs how the Russian capture of Toretsk would be a massive blow on the Ukrainian front lines, to the Ukrainian front lines in Donbass. It would mean that the Russians would have an open way to advance north towards Konstantinovka and Kramatorsk, the last big urban conurbation still under Ukrainian control in Donbass. Now, even as Toretsk is collapsing, there are more reports of further Russian advances in Chasiv Yar. I'm not going to go over the detail of those. All I would say that there was a very interesting detail about this latest Russian advance, which is on the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, and that is that the Chechen fighters of the Akhmat Special Forces Unit are apparently involved in this advance. Now that suggests to me that either the entire unit or at least a part of it has been redeployed back to Chasiv Yar from the Kursk area, which further strongly suggests that the Russians now feel that they have the situation in Kursk well under control. Now, I'll come to that in a moment. But anyway, the Chechens are back fighting in Chasiv Yar. An encirclement operation clearly is underway there. We will probably see an ongoing collapse of Ukrainian positions in Chasiv Yar very quickly after Toretsk falls. It's very difficult to see how the Ukrainians can continue to cling on to Chasiv Yar if they lose Toretsk. Just saying. Anyway, further north still, there's lots of reports about the Russians making advances in Kupiansk region and along the Zherebets rivers further south. There's a very interesting article in Redovka, which has made a point which I have made before, which is that the Russian advances along the Zherebets river are already putting Ukrainian defenses around Seversk in jeopardy, and because Seversk is looking increasingly isolated at the far eastern end of what is now looking like a very precarious salient. And, well, there's still argument about whether the Russians have captured Verkha Kamyanska, the village immediately to the east of Seversk, whether all the claims for advances by the Russians around Seversk are true or not. My guess is that they are true. Perhaps there is still fighting taking place in one or two places that the Russians say that they have captured. But I think that the Russians do indeed have effective control over all of these places. But Seversk should not be looked at anyway in isolation. The fact is that all around Seversk, north, south, in Chasiv Yar, wherever, the position of the Ukrainians is deteriorating. And exactly as our old friend Andrei Marochko said, that must in the end mean that the Ukrainians, if they try to cling on in Seversk, risk getting themselves surrounded. Now, since we've talked about Marochko, we might as well turn to our other old friend, Vladimir Rogov, from Zaporozhye, Russian-controlled Zaporozhye. He now has the title of chairman of the Civic Chamber Commission on Sovereignty, Patriotic Projects and Support for Veterans. He's now provided a detailed account, or a fairly detailed account, of the Russian advance on the east bank of the Dnieper towards the city of Zaporozhye. There'd been a lot of talk a couple of days ago that the Ukrainians had counterattacked and pushed the Russians back in this area. But Rogov appears to be contradicting this. He's reported by TASS as saying this: there are active hostilities of high intensity in Kamanskoye. This is the village on the east bank of the Dnieper River that the Russians seem to be trying to capture. And he goes on to say, we have the initiative in our hands. The pressure by the Russian army on the Ukrainians is immense. Our troops have improved their positions along the front line and gained a foothold on the positions already taken. So he is speaking as if the Russian advance on Kamenskoye and towards Zaporozhye on the east bank of the Dnieper River is continuing. And again, I would assume him to be a reliable source. Now, elsewhere, we go further east in the Ugledar area. lots of reports that the Russians advancing on the village of Katerinovka, of mass surrenders by Ukrainian troops there. I have very few details about this. I've just seen that those claims have been made. There are apparently now pictures which show Russian troops in the western area of Tsukurinye raising their flags. The Ukrainians are still claiming that they hold on, that they're fighting on in the western outskirts of Tsukurinye. I have to say, I think this is unlikely by now. These pictures, to me, suggest that Tsukurinye is indeed under Russian control. Further confirming that the Ukrainian troops in the 4 villages northwest or northeast of Kurachovo are indeed in a cauldron. There are also now apparently pictures and photographs of Russian vehicles, armoured vehicles, on the mine and slag heap at the northeastern edge of Selidovo, which the Russians seem to be encircling, Selidovo, that they're encircling, but they now seem to be, there now seems to be fighting going on in the coal mine and in the slag heap. There were reports way back weeks ago that the Russians had actually captured this coal mine and slag heap. There's suggestions that those reports were untrue. I've discussed this in previous programs. I suspect there's been intense fighting going on for this control of this coal mine and slag heap. Sometimes the Russians have had the advantage, sometimes the Ukrainians. Gradually, over time, weight of numbers is starting to tell, and the Russians are closer now probably to complete uncontested control of the coal mine and the slag heap than they had been previously. And by general consensus, if that happens, it will be the end of Ukrainian resistance in Selidovo, where the Russians anyway appear to be working towards laying a trap. And, well, if we go to Kursk region, yesterday, more reports of Russian advances in Kursk region. Firstly, as I think I mentioned in my program yesterday, it looks as if the Ukrainians have been entirely expelled from Glushkovo region. They tried to advance in this area as well to support their main forces in Sudzha. Apparently you pronounce the D. But the attack ultimately was completely unsuccessful. And we're now getting reports of Russian drone and missile attacks on Ukrainian positions south of the border adjoining the Glushkovo region of Kursk, which may suggest that it is the Russians now who are preparing an incursion into Ukrainian territory, in exactly this area. And in Kursk region, well, we now have apparently film and photographic evidence which confirms Russian control of the village of Tolstoy Lug, close to Lyubimovka, as uncertainty as to who exactly controls Lyubimovka, but the Russians seem to be continuing their advance from the west towards Sudzha, even as they lay siege and seek to storm the village of Plekhovo to the south of Sudzha, giving every impression that they're preparing a cauldron for the Ukrainians in Sudzha as well. And anyway, the very latest reports do appear to confirm that the Ukrainians are trying to pull troops out of the Kursk salient, but it's also claimed that the Ukrainians are trying to send fresh troops into the Kursk salient in their place. In other words, that a rotation is underway. As I expected, Zelensky and Syrskyi have invested far too much of their prestige in this Kursk operation. They probably worry that his failure will lead to a crisis for Zelensky's regime. And so for that reason, instead of withdrawing from Kursk, as they urgently ought to do, they are reinforcing failure in the hope that something can be turned round. Now, earlier in this program, I discussed the diplomatic standstill in the West, the Americans refusing to negotiate with the Russians, doing so, especially ahead of an election, is out of the question, apparently. It would be too big a humiliation. It would mean capitulation to Russian terms, and that is something that the United States absolutely will not do. And it could also open up the way for discussions of Russian demands for a rethinking of the security situation in Europe. The Europeans unwilling to conduct negotiations with the Russians. Either they're furious with Orban for even floating that possibility. They sense that if they begin a negotiation without the Americans, not only will they be at a disadvantage, but that criticism of the whole NATO system might start to rise to the surface within European societies, with perhaps European publics saying that if we can make peace over Ukraine with the Russians without the Americans, then why do we need the Americans at all? A question which the current European leadership, very committed to the alliance with the United States, does not want asked. So the Europeans unable to move. So the ball is left once again with the Ukrainians themselves. After all, this is a war fought over on their land. It is their men that are dying in this war. It is their economy which is being destroyed. They need to start thinking now about how they get out of this mess. There's no sign that President Zelensky himself can do that. I'm deeply skeptical whether anyone else in the Ukrainian political system can. But if there is such a person, then the time for them to act is now. Anyway, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.